everyone. My name is Aaron Willis. And welcome to today's panel. What do Jesuit values have to do with tech companies? As I said, my name is Aaron Willis. I'm Director of Ignatian Formation and the Bannon Forum here at Santa Clara University as part of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education. And so before we begin, I'd like to pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people, who trace our ancestry through the Mission Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people, past and present. Thank you. And so I was excited for today's panel because it focuses on a critical role that the values of Santa Clara University as a Jesuit Catholic institution can have beyond our campus when individuals and youth work to put them into action. And a critical part of our identity as a Jesuit institution is this idea of contemplatives in action, right? So that beyond thinking about technology and ethics and what it means to be human and how we might flourish or having conversations about this, right, we also need to put those things into action so that what emanates from our institutions are strategies and practical approaches to addressing some of these questions. And so when I saw the announcement of the launch of the Institute for Technology, Ethics, and Culture and the handbook, I was really energized by the way that the Institute and the handbook were doing the work of translating our values and the ideas and knowledge generated on campus and putting it into practical action, putting it into tools that people could use to put these things into action. And they were really addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time. And so what I'm going to do is briefly kind of explain what is the Institute, what is the handbook, and then turn it over to the panel to kind of unpack how those things connect to our Jesuit values, how we might think about using these principles in action, and do that. So the Institute for Technology, Ethics, and Culture is housed at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and it's a collaboration between the Center and the Vatican's Dicastery for Culture and Education. The Institute convenes leaders from business, civil society, academia, government, and all faith and belief traditions to promote deeper thought on technology's impact on humanity. So building on the work of the Markkula Center over the past 37 years, it helped corporations apply ethical thinking and create positive change. And the center conducted primary research, interviews, and conferred with many corporations to produce the handbook, which I have here, and you can find online in digital copies as well. And so ethics in the age of disruptive technologies, an operational roadmap, or more briefly, the ITEC Handbook, offers organizations a strategic plan to enhance ethical management practices and empowers them to navigate the complex landscape of disruptive technologies such as AI, machine learning, encryption, tracking, and many others while upholding strong ethical standards. And so again, in today's panel, we'll kind of unpack the background to this document, or this book, and the background to the Institute and how we might think about those things. And right briefly, I'll just introduce our panelists and then turn it over to Brian. But Jose Roger Flao is a retired, hands-on, high-end tech operations executive with an extensive background in global supply chain and operations management with companies such as Burroughs, Unisys, Raychem, SanDisk, and Corsair Components. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at San Jose State University, where he teaches engineering management systems in a global society. He holds an electrical engineering undergraduate degree from ITPLG in Belgium and an MSE in engineering management from San Jose State University. Brian Patrick Green is the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here at Santa Clara. And he's worked extensively with technology corporations as well as organizations such as the World Economic Forum, the Partnership on AI, and the Vatican's Dicastery for Culture and Education. He teaches AI ethics in Santa Clara University's Graduate School of Engineering, and he holds a doctorate and MA degrees in ethics and social theory for the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, a BS in genetics from the University of California at Davis, and is author or editor of several volumes on ethics and technology. Father Brendan McGuire is the pastor of St. Simon Parish in Los Altos. He was ordained a priest in 2000 and has an STB and master's degree in theology from St. Patrick's Seminary and University of Menlo Park. He also has an undergraduate degree in electronic engineering and a master's degree in computer science and math from Trinity College Dublin. Father Brendan is a co-founder of St. Joseph Financial Services, which is a finance and accounting resource designed specifically for nonprofit governance. SJFS leverages expertise in technology, process optimization, and accounting to build an outsourced finance and accounting solution. And Father Brennan was Vicar General for special projects for over 12 years, while also serving as pastor of Holy Spirit Parish and School for over 16 years. And our fourth panelist is Anne Gregg Skeet, and she is the senior director of leadership ethics at the Markla Center for Applied Ethics. She works with corporations and organizations such as the World Economic Forum, the Partnership on AI, and the Vatican's Dicastery for Culture and Education. She teaches in corporate board readiness programs at Santa Clara Silicon Valley Executive Center. She served as CEO of American Leadership Forum in Silicon Valley for 8 years, worked for a decade as a Knight Ridder executive, and served as president of Notre Dame High School in San Jose. She's a graduate of Bucknell University and has a Master's of Business Administration degree from Harvard Business School. So I'll hand it over to Brian, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So thank you.
Thank you. Aaron, thank you so much for the introductions, and thank you so much to the audience. You've filled the room, although mostly from the second table. So what we're going to do today is, like Aaron was just saying, we're going to talk about ITEC, which is the Institute for Technology, Ethics, and Culture, and then we will be talking about the handbook also, which, as Aaron noted, there are physical versions of it, but it's available for free online. So with that, I'll just say, I want to ask Father Brendan, could you tell us a little bit about the genesis of ITEC and what its purpose is?
Yeah. I would say, like, one of the things I was involved in a technology industry here before I became a priest, so I'm kind of a transplant into the church, and so so during the time, even though I was as priesthood, I've always remained in contact with my business friends in the tech world, and over those many years, we came in different contact. I used to hear different conversations, but about 10 or 12 years ago, the conversations became more pointed, more nervous about what they were looking at. And of course, now my friends, most of them are CEOs or C-suite, and they were talking about what they were seeing coming down the line. They were talking about AI, primarily. And this is 10, 12 years ago, not 10, 12 weeks or months ago. And they were cautious. They were saying, like, you need to do something. I said, what do I do? The church needs to do something. Like, we need help. We need help in navigating this. This is outside of our pay range. And it's very lonely at the top. And I've been having these conversations, and I started to notice that they become more and more and more and more. Now, so I attempted to get some of them together, and it was really hard because they're all super busy. They don't, like, I could have a lunch meeting with one, but the other person wouldn't be available for 6 months. And so I befriended Kirk Hansen, who's the founder of the Markla Center, and he and I were bantering back and forth, and we were involved in the bishop, and we had these conversations. Well, what can we do to bring these people together? And so we had all these different conversations. We said, they really don't recognize, CEOs don't recognize the local bishop as any sort of convening power. We needed somebody who had higher convening power. And we said, we talked about the UN, and I said, well, the Vatican, it really has a bit of convening power. And so at that same time, I had met Bishop Paul Tai, who at that time, was head of the communications, the Undersecretary of Communications, the Dicastery Department, and then since got transferred to Culture, Department of Culture, or the Dicastery of Culture, and then since has been merged with a different dicastery now. They're all three. And he and I sort of hit it off, and we started to explore conversation. What could we do together? And so about 5 years ago, but bear in mind that those conversations took place over 5 years. So that's how, it wasn't like all of them go. And each time the temperature was raising and raising and raising to the point where there was sort of a burning platform, no pun intended. And so what we did, and under the previous president of the university, we formed a partnership with Markla, and Markla had been involved right from the beginning in those early conversations with Kirk. And we formed this institute, really initiative, probably more than an institute per se, of technology, ethics, and culture with the desire to convene. And what were the church is only interested, my only sort of, if you would, magic wand would be to bring people together. I don't have a skill in my data technology at this point. Now, ethics is not my area of expertise, but that's where marketing brings in its expertise is with the whole concept of ethics and in marketplace. But we needed somebody on a technological point of view, somebody who'd been inside the corporations to help do this. And then the question is, what? What are we going to do? And so we had a meeting that we convened ourselves. We had several meetings, and then we were invited to a Vatican summit called The Common Good in the Digital Era. And we were invited to speak at that panel. And Brian, you might remember you were on the panel. I was the moderator, and we had somebody from Facebook, we had somebody from Western Digital, and Jose was with us at that time as well. But as we talked about it at that panel, I realized we were the only one in the entire conference of over 200 people who were talking about something practical. We were talking about applied ethics. And that's what Markel has in unique. And so we realized we had something here, but we still needed to do something. So we came back, and then COVID hit. And then and maybe Jose, you were with us in that time in Rome, in the Vatican. Why that was such I think a pivotal point, and you saw how we switched, and when we came back, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you see it from a point of view of inside an organization versus from the convening on the outside.
What they did on the panel was to talk about the Christchurch, New Zealand incident there, and how Facebook and the Western Digital reacted to that. I'm an engineer working in high tech, in high volume, and focusing on the practical side. And I made a parallel with the quality movement. And ethics and quality are not at the same level, obviously. But in the late 70s, companies were struggling with that. How do we put quality in the organization, in the products, and so on? And it took 50 plus years to get to where we are today with ISO 9000 and company having this in their DNA. And I suggested that there was a similar track that technology ethics was going to take, but we don't have 30 years, we don't have 50 years. So I think they needed a nice guy who asked simple question like, what? And how? Right?
Yeah, and that came about. So the first, if you would, product of our ITEC was while we set it up, well, what are we going to have? It was the first thing you brought to us is we need something to go to executives with, and that's the birth of the ITEC Handbook, which sort of concretely spells out, and we can talk a little more about that. But that's kind of how the whole thing came about and where we're at today.
So yeah, the history of the organization I think is really fascinating because everything is, as both of you said, it started really coming together in about 2018, 2019. And so September 2019, we had this meeting in the Vatican, and we actually all got to shake hands with the Pope. And he gave, a little talk where he talked about the role of technology. And this emphasized to us also that we really needed to be doing something practical. This was a time where we had to figure out, what are we going to do now that we have gathered ourselves together into an organization? What practical thing can we do? So this next question is kind of directed towards you, Jose. Why a handbook, and how did the handbook come to be?
Okay. So after many meetings, after that trip to Rome, the question was, what are we going to do? And the comments were, we need a framework. I said, great, framework for what? So that took a bit of a discussion to figure out what the framework was all about. And we didn't know how to call it. Well, we ended up with a framework for technology ethics. And what we are using in the book, we call this a technology ethics governance framework. So companies have to decide what they want to do. Right? So we started with that framework. And then how do companies come to that point of having an ethics governance, technology ethics governance framework to implementing that into their organization, in the day-to-day business, in all the different processes. So that's why it became a handbook. It's how do you go through the whole process of discerning, do you want to do this as a company? As a first stage. The second stage is, okay, where are we? Are we halfway there? The third stage is the development of that guidance, that technology ethics governance framework. Then you have to break this in two. You have to work on the culture. You have to design all kinds of processes to develop the right culture, and we'll talk about that. But also you have to talk to the engineers and how in the everyday actions and the algorithms that they are creating, how do they implement that? And then when you have that implemented, it's ongoing, it's continuous improvement. How do you monitor, how do you watch this, how do you control the progress?
Yeah, and I remember I was talking to you when we were deciding how to write this handbook, and the word culture kept coming up, and so this really made me think to myself, well, Anne is the person we need to talk to about this. This is not something I can handle. This is not something, Jose had his area of expertise, I had my area of expertise, but we really needed Anne to talk about the cultural side of things. So can you talk a little bit about how your expertise fits into the handbook?
You mean you didn't come get me just because you needed a girl? As one of the things that, because it's been true that the project has been largely in the group that went to Rome, a group of men. So, and I think in technology, that's often the case. And so it's good to have representation in the group. And the work that I brought to the table was really grounded in the work that I've done around leadership and business ethics since I've been at the Markkula Center, but also my career before I came to the Markkula Center, which was partly in industry and partly in civic leadership roles in different nonprofit organizations. And in one of those nonprofit organizations called American Leadership Forum Silicon Valley, which is right here in the Valley, it brings together leaders from the nonprofit, the public, and the private sector, and they participate in a year-long fellowship where they look at both their own leadership development and then their engagement in the community. And in that, part of that includes a 6-day camping trip. So you get people kind of out of their element a little bit, and they're sitting around the fire and they're telling stories. They've kind of left their titles behind from their day jobs here in the Valley. And I happened to have that role in the early 2000s as a lot of legislation was coming online, including Sarbanes-Oxley, that was really starting to hold chief executives to a different standard, to a level of responsibility, individual responsibility for what everybody in their organizations was actually doing. And so these CEOs would sit around the fire and they'd say, oh my gosh, I'm on the hook for everything that people in my company do. I mean, how can I make sure that they're doing the right thing and that they're behaving well? And it was a very legitimate question and a real concern. I think it's hard sometimes, as you say, it's lonely at the top, and it's hard sometimes to identify with the problems of people who are in the corner office and have the responsibility for the whole organization. But they take it really seriously, and that was a really a significant concern. So when I came to the Markkula Center, that's really the question I set out to answer, which is what can the CEO or any business executive do to try and encourage ethical behavior in their organization, and how do you go about that? And a big part of the answer turns out to be in the culture of the organization itself. So you can do and have a lot of great practices and policies and hire incredibly talented people, but if the culture that all of that is working in and people are trying to accomplish their tasks in is an unhealthy culture, it's hard for those things it's hard for the business objectives or the organizational objectives to be met. And so, some of what's in the book comes directly from some of the research I've done here in Silicon Valley, going into technology companies and trying to answer the question of how do ethics become pervasive in organizations? How do you get ethics to really take hold? And so through that research, we identified a couple of different conditions that are present, and when those conditions are present, then it's actually more likely that ethics will get used. So we can come up with all the great frameworks and all the great tools, but if you don't take a more holistic look at it and consider the organization that all that is happening in, then it's less likely that you'll be successful in terms of actually achieving or having people behave and think through their decisions using ethics. So that was the work, and of course, Brian, you and I have done a lot of work together and with a lot of the same organizations, the World Economic Forum, the Partnership on AI, and through both those affiliations in particular, we've gotten to do a lot of writing and go out and talk to a lot of companies around the world. And Brian's written a couple of case studies about companies' best practices. I worked on a paper with the World Economic Forum that was about designing ethics into organizations, ethics by design, and sort of what you can do in an organization to actually bring ethics forward. And I think in that work, we got a chance to actually, work alongside of people who were really grappling with these issues, the ones that you were talking about, Dr. Brendan, and really trying to resolve them. And so what's inside the book is both the principles and the stages, which I know you're going to talk a little bit more about, but also these real life stories and these things that we learned from people who were actually trying to do the work in the trenches.
Yeah. One thing I would say is that this book really is kind of the distillation of decades of experience between the three of us and research and just experiences that we've had to really bring all these things together. And it's actually had a pretty good impact so far. It's, like I said, it's for free on the Marvelous Center website. It's been downloaded 3,000 times already. So it's moving out there, and we've had between 75 and 100 media stories. So just getting out there into places like Fortune and onto podcasts and into other places like that. And we've gone in front of a couple boards of companies so far and talked about these things. So there's pretty good interest out there. And I think one of the things that we did when we were writing the book is we thought about the fact that people have good intentions that they want to act on, but they need to know how to actually implement those good intentions. It's one thing to have good intentions, it's one thing to have a framework of principles or something like that, and lots of technology companies have those frameworks now, or those kind of sets of principles. But actually making them practical is kind of the really difficult part of it, and that's what we tried to do here. We saw this problem approaching about, I guess, 5 years ago, back when we started this project. We said people were already coming out with principles, but they didn't have the expertise for how to implement them. So I'll just say a little bit about the principles now, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jose to talk about the stages. But one of the things that we did with our framework for thinking about these things was to think in terms of, you have your very highest level principle, and then you have little principles that kind of come down from there all the way until you get to the ground level where you can actually implement things. So in our book, we talked about every company, or not every company, many companies already have their own set of principles, but we gave a suggested set of principles where the anchoring principle is our actions are for the common good of humanity and the environment. So keeping the common good centered there right in the middle and thinking about humanity, of course, and also the environment, because we all are living on the same planet together. So that's very top level principle. We then broke that down into 7 sub-principles: respect for human dignity and rights, promote human well-being, invest in humanity, promote justice, access, diversity, equity, and inclusion, recognize that Earth is for all life, maintain accountability, and promote transparency and explainability. So those are the 7 principles that we have there. And you'll notice that there are some slightly different emphases there. The emphasis on investing in humanity, for example, is not something you'll see a whole lot in a lot of corporate tech ethics principles, and also the emphasis on the environment. There is a sustainability movement, of course, in corporations, excuse me, but really keeping it at a very holistic level and an inclusive level is what we were trying to do. So then the level below that, kind of the third level down from the top, are the specifying principles. We came up with 46 of those, so we put those in an appendix at the end of the book. But these 46 specifying principles really start to get into the kind of the details of what's going on with each one of those principles, because there's just a lot to keep in mind with every one of those. And then the level below that are the action principles. And I'll just give an example of an action principle. So for example, well, let me give context first. What is difficult about the action principles? The action principles are for the very specific cases within the company. And those things are so specific that we can't write them into the book because we don't know what the company is doing. We don't know what particular situations they're facing. So, for example, if you wanted to apply respect for human dignity and rights, and then you go to the specifying principle of safety, security, and reliability, the action principle might be something like, we will store data securely in proportion to the harm that might occur if it were to be inappropriately released. For example, in W case, whatever that case might be, you take X security measures, and in Y case, you would take Z security measures. So you have to very much get into the details of what exactly are we dealing with, what system, what technological system are we looking at, and what security measures need to be placed onto something if we are going to make sure that we're upholding our ethical principles in that particular case. Jose, why don't you tell us a little bit about the stages that the handbook goes through?
So the handbook is built around a roadmap. How does a company journey through the different stages? And the first stage, obviously, is executive management. They have to decide if they want to do something, right? If nothing happens there, we don't need to go to the next stage. In the book, in the handbook, we talk about the stages, but also the ownership of each of the stages. And it's different people in the organization who have the ownership. So it starts with discernment and a decision from the board of directors and the CEO to say, yes, we are going to do this. Second stage is this, we want to go there, but where are we in this journey? So it's establishing a baseline. Where are we? And by the way, one of the signs of the company deciding to do something, there are a couple of deliverables, like appointing a technology ethics officer, making a public statement that this is what the company stands for. Similar to 30 years ago, quality statement that you can see on all the website of all the companies. So they have decided to do something, they know where they are. Now, what are the directions that the company is giving to all the workers? The third stage is the definition of this technology governance framework, technology ethics governance framework. And the owner of that stage is the ethics officer, working with the support of the CEO. So it's in broad terms, what do we want to do? How do we want to do it? Then the next stage is divided in two tracks. One track is for the culture, all the management, HR. What are the things that they have to do to transform the culture of the entire company to focus on technology ethics? In parallel, the engineers, the people touching the products, also have to figure out how they are going to implement this framework that the CEO has given them. They have to put in place a management system. What are the processes that need to be changed? And we make references, while we were working on the book, at the beginning we didn't have much help from standards and things like that. But I don't know if you know it, but IEEE has been very, very active in technology ethics, and they have 2 or 3 absolutely fantastic standards that help answer the questions and get the answers on what needs to be done. For instance, do you know your stakeholders? Do you know the people you can impact or could be impacted by your product? What are their technology, their ethical value requirements? So for the engineers, one of the first things is to have something defined in a spec. When a new product is developed, the marketing organization decides or identifies the things that should be in the product. Well, it's the same thing. Using the methodology defined by IEEE, how do you define a spec, a technology ethics spec for your product? So the engineers know that they have to meet that spec throughout the entire life cycle. So working in parallel, the people touching the product, HR. So the next stage, everything is implemented, and it's just the beginning. You have to continue watching it. You have to control what you're doing. What are the key metrics? What are the targets for these key metrics? So like you have reviews to review the financial status of the company, you need to have operations reviews focusing on technology ethics. And in that stage, it's about continuous improvement. So these are the 5 stages that we are using in the handbook. And one last point, companies start on their journey at different stages. Some have done nothing. Others have already done something. They can go in the handbook to the stage where they are at and find some answers or some questions that they need to find answers to. That's why it's a handbook. It's not something that you read from cover to cover. It's when you are in a particular stage, you can get help that's focused on that stage. It's a practical roadmap.
Yeah, that's that emphasis on practice, and also the fact that you're coming to the handbook with what your organization's already done, and you can fit right into one of those stages. And often some of the people that we talk to, or from some of the research that we've done, we'll see, oh, this company has already, they've kind of gotten into stage 3, but they never really got stage 1 and 2 figured out. They need to go back and kind of shore up the foundations. Or they've got stages 3 and 4 kind of figured out, but they actually forgot about stage 5, which is to look back and make sure that you're actually making progress on this type of journey that you're making. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk now about, we're here with the Ignatian Center, and we're here at a Jesuit Catholic University, and I just want to go through each of us, because I know we each have something to say about this, which is how is the handbook and how is ITEC an expression of Ignatian and Jesuit philosophy and spirituality? So, Jose, I wanted to start with you.
Well, working in operations in high tech and being Catholic, the bridge is very easy to cross to apply the ethical principle in everything that's being done, not just on how you deal with people, but in all the processes. So, and I've done this in different parts of the world. I spent a lot of time in China. Of course, being in operation and supply chain, you spend a lot of time in China. And recognizing that the same principle is understood differently in different parts of the world. So for me, it's putting in practice, if you want, my Catholic beliefs, my Catholic upbringing, and translating this in not just a code of ethics for people leading by example, obviously, but also a code of ethics for the technology.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point, I think, for the handbook, which is that it's completely secularly argued. There's nothing in here that's explicitly religious. We do have a foreword that is from Bishop Tai, so he wrote that for us. But other than that, everything is something that's meant to be argued in language and philosophy that everyone has accessible to them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I want to go to you next, Anne, so that you can.
So I'll talk about sort of the Jesuit underpinnings that I see in the work we did, even though I agree it is it's secular and can be used by anybody. In fact, I think that's the Jesuit approach to things too, is to always make things accessible to people from whatever tradition they're coming from. And certainly I think the book does that. But I also want to go back to something you said, Aaron, as you were opening up the panel, which is this idea of contemplatives in action, of both thinking things through, but then also doing something about it. And so a very central part of the book and the beginning of the journey, if you will, as we describe it, is this whole idea of discernment, of being more thoughtful about what you want your organization to do and be, and making that commitment that Jose was talking about. And it can look in a corporate setting like an ethics policy statement or having a tech ethics champion, but it's really the process of a leadership team going through and having a discussion, a dialogue with one another about the values in the organization and what's important to them. And people do wonder, does this actually happen in corporate settings? And it does. And we were part of those conversations and continue to be part of those conversations. The boardroom presentations that we've done since the book has come out have been sort of education sessions that corporate boards do to try and get up to speed on certain topics. And of course, right now, everybody wants to think and figure out what they're supposed to do about artificial intelligence. And so they brought us in to help think about that. And because we went immediately to the in-action part, the practice part, we started those first conversations with emphasizing the stages and the different steps that the organization needed to take. And I think we were pleasantly surprised, or at least I'll speak for myself, but I think Brian was too, that the board members really want to engage in the principles. They really want to spend some time talking about the values that they should be laying out in their organization, and they don't want to get it wrong. I think people recognize that the artificial intelligence is developing so quickly and so powerfully that there is this potential for things to go wrong, and no one wants that to happen on their watch. So we emphasized discernment and this idea that was a leadership responsibility, but also this notion, as Jose said, that leadership can come from anywhere in the organization, which is a very Ignatian perspective as well. We're all leaders in our own lives and in our own pathway. And so we did and have and continue to encounter people who are, not in what you might identify as a formal leadership position in their organization, but still able to have tremendous impact because they've decided, they've made a commitment to doing and developing technology ethically. And they started maybe in a skunkworks way in the middle of the organization, and then it starts to sort of seep out from there and take hold in other parts of the organization. So it may be that looping back, that it started in some mid-level part, but then you go back and you get the senior level commitment to support it. So there's that leadership and that discernment piece. There is this idea, as I mentioned earlier, of accompanying people. In other words, we didn't write the book with one idea in mind. We offer the principles as a starting point if people want to use them, but we know that companies will adopt them on their own, and many companies have their own technology ethics principles. So we're much more interested in helping them develop with whichever stage it is that they need to be focusing on and working on, not just necessarily doing it in the sequence that we laid out. And I think it's fair to say that because we've worked with so many companies and studied so many companies, at this point, I think it's a toss-up of who's learning from who. They bring us in there sometimes to share what we know about ethics, but we're learning so much about how they're working on things that keeps us current in the work that we do. And then also, I think Jose touched on, but this idea of, and just reinforcing that notion of accompaniment, that we learn their culture first. And that's one of the things that's part of the second stage of assessment, is for the organization, the company itself, to grow a little self-awareness, to do their own culture self-assessment, which is a tool that we have at the Markowitz Center that helps people to really take the temperature of the culture for ethics and to learn some things about their culture in that way. And then I guess the last thing that stands out to me as being, certainly comes from what the Jesuits have taught me, is, our approach is holistic. It's looking at the entire organization and all the people in the organization, not just coming at it from either the technology piece or the organizational piece. You really have to have both, and I think that's what makes the experience or the ability to take what's in the book and apply it a much more valuable experience.
Yeah, just building on that, one of the things that the way that I see Ignatian spirituality engaging with the handbook is a lot with the idea of magis and ad maiorem dei gloriam. I went to St. Ignatius High School in San Francisco, so I had to write AMDG on the top of my papers, and it took me a long time to figure out what does that mean. I was in the Jesuit volunteers also, so I got a little bit, an idea of how to go out there into the world and try to actually do things, and so I taught in a high school in the Marshall Islands for 2 years. But this idea of doing more, of going out there and really trying to improve the common good, make an impact on society that's positive, is something that has really motivated me to get into technology ethics, because technology, of course, is extremely powerful, and we're getting into AI now, which is making very powerful choices at large scale, the vastest scale that anyone's ever been making choices. When you think about the number of people on social media who are being fed information by these sorts of algorithms that are really just automating human decision making in ways that most people can't even understand. Even the people who are creating them, of course, didn't have much clue as to what would happen if they started recommending people to move into QAnon groups and things like that. Guess what happens? People get in those groups. And this idea of education and awareness is something, as a university, of course, we think about education all the time, but there's also really a mission of education to the entire world. There's so much awareness that needs to be raised in the world about how technology is operating, what it's doing to people, how it's really setting up the world of the future that we're going to live in, and are we setting up a world that we actually want to live in or not? Or are we setting up a world where we look at it and we say, I kind of don't like the way things are going. Maybe we should make better choices. And that gets to the ethics question, right? All of a sudden we have to say, okay, we actually do have choices about how these things operate. We do have ways, we have tools, and we have resources, and we have ways of making these decisions work out better. And that's very core to the mission of the Markowitz Center. We're constantly trying to give people the resources that they need in order to make the good ethical decisions that they already want to make. They just need to have particular ways of thinking about things, whether it's an ethical framework, like the Markowitz Center Framework for Ethical Decision Making, or whether it is our ethics and technology practice resources, which are designed for engineers who are working in engineering organizations. And those resources, by the way, are a part of stage 4B in here, excuse me, that Jose was talking about. And lots of, once again, lots and lots of experience and research have gone into making this book possible. So I want to turn to Father Brendan, because you have a lot of expertise in Ignatian spirituality. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your engagement?
Yeah, so I probably first have a disclaimer. I'm not a Jesuit. I'm a diocesan priest, and I'm in a Jesuit institution. I feel like the buildings might cave in on me by talking about this, and I'm going to talk about Ignatian spirituality. But I have a real affinity to Ignatian spirituality, even though I'm not a Jesuit. I've taken the exercises myself 5 times. I've gone on the silent retreat for 30 days, and I've taken 5 or 6 other people through it for many, many years. So I've done it multiple times. I'm very familiar with the process behind spiritual exercises. And if you just think at the roots of that spiritual exercise, what Ignatius did in his famous cannonball movement while he was discerning the spirits, he came up with this manual, what we could now call the spiritual exercises, which is, recommend taking over 30 days, but adapted over 30 weeks or longer, or some variation thereof. And in it is this discernment, which Jose mentioned earlier about what's really embedded in this book, is this idea of discerning the spirits. Now, in Ignatius used the rather sort of heavy language of the good spirits and the evil spirits, and I understand you talk about the devil very much, and we didn't certainly talk about it in the book. But there is a movement with which that what we do can pull you towards the good things, and that which can pull you away from the good things, that which is sort of evil spirits as in moving us away. And to be able to discern that, one has to take the time. One has to take a methodical approach. And that's what I love about Ignatian, why I think it's so pertinent for Silicon Valley, and I think we should have every business executive kind of go to it, because it's such a clear, methodical, systematic, and systemic approach to process making, or decision making in a process. And that's what Jose's sort of genius inside this book is, this operationalization of this decision making that's very clearly delineated. Now, I think it implicitly follows the Ignatian model, not maybe explicitly. We don't talk about evil spirits or good spirits, but clearly we're saying, look, there is a good in all this, and that was Ignatius's foundation of all his exercises, is that in everything that we do, we believe God is at work. And that we listen to God because God is the creator of all things, and inside of that, God creates all this. And therefore, if you want to kind of follow God's will, that which is for the good of humanity, then we need to listen. And when we listen, we have this choice. Is this better or this better? And most often the choices, and why I love what we've done in this book, and while I didn't write any part of the book, or I helped guide some parts of it in these moments, is because I think the decision was, it's not between good and evil most often. It's most often, and this is what Ignatius's genius is, it's between good and less good. Good, so you can start off with good and less good. If you choose the lesser of two goods, you do it, and it doesn't seem like that much of a difference. And then you choose the lesser two goods, lesser two goods, lesser two goods, and over a period of time, whether that be weeks, months, or years, while you are operating up here as an organization or as an individual inside the organization, you are now operating down here. And not one step along the way was it a major step. And what this book does, and this process really is this operationalization process, forces us to continue to keep the conversation way up here. What is the best between these two goods? And I think the foundation of it is very Ignatian, because he talks about the good that we see in it. And this is Bishop Paul's sort of insistence, if you remember right at the beginning, that we believe that that there's a common good with which all men and women of faith, of all faiths of all over the world, seek to do what is good. And we hold that up as the higher goal. And I do think that's really rooted. And that's why what Ignatius did 500 years ago, think about that, 500 years ago, has been applied in every major institution, Jesuit institution in the world, and is applicable today as if it was yesterday. It's amazing. So I'm very much supportive of it, and obviously excited about it.
All right. Excuse me. So we've reached our last question for the panel before we're going to go to audience question and answer. So as we were talking about this recently, yesterday, we were saying, what are we going to talk about in this panel tomorrow? And we came up with this last question, which is, what's important about this? Why is this actually relevant to anyone? Why this topic here and now? And why at a Jesuit university like Santa Clara? And Anne, you had some thoughts, so why don't you go ahead and lead?
Yeah, I think my biggest observation was just I came to the Markle Center in 2014, so it's been almost 10 years. And as I say, my remit is sort of leadership and business ethics. And when I first started doing the work, and I would go, we had a business ethics partnership quarterly meeting where companies would come and talk about issues. And we'd try and get sort of people in boardrooms engaged in ethics. And I remember having lunch with a very seasoned corporate board member who sat on a number of boards then and still sits on a number of boards, has been general counsel at major companies here in the Valley, and was talking to him about, putting ethics on the agenda in the boardroom. And he said to me, in all sincerity, if I did that, I would get laughed out of the boardroom. That's not really a topic that they wanted to be talking about. And that's not what the board needs to be concerned about. But now, and certainly in the past 4 to 5 years, there's been a total shift. And people are wanting to talk about ethics and wanting to talk about ethics in corporate settings regularly and seeking people to come in and talk about that. And yes, some of it really is the pace of change and the technology, but a lot of it is what's been going on societally with first the Me Too movement and all the DEI issues, the murder of George Floyd, some things that have really brought social issues into the workplace in a way that, I used to work in corporate America, and I certainly don't remember them being that present then. So from my perspective, there's been this real interest, a genuine interest in ethics and in having it part of everything that's happening in the companies. Some people that we work with at Salesforce just wrote an article earlier this week that published in the Harvard Business Review, and it's about how to develop an ethical artificial intelligence assistant, sort of how your Siri or your Alexa is made more ethical. That's such a practical need, and it's the kind of thing that could have been skipped over entirely 10 years ago. I'm not sure people were thinking about how to make the technology ethical. And so the fact that that's there in people's consciousness is really part of why I think we needed to write the book when we did. And the fact that people trusted us. I mean, they actually were saying to those of us that are affiliated with the Markle Center, you're there, you're in Silicon Valley, and you're at a Jesuit university. I think people recognize the value of a values-based organization. And so that I think the sense that we would have a point of view and a perspective that would be useful to people. And I would say, certainly in my time, it's been amongst the most rewarding work we've done because people really need it and they're asking for it and they're open to it. And that kind of openness is really wonderful to see.
Yeah, just to emphasize that, in the last 10 years, there really has been a seismic shift in the interest in ethics. And it's partly driven by political issues and social issues and cultural issues, but a lot of it has technology pushing it also. So it's really been fascinating to be here, of course, at the Jesuit University in Silicon Valley at Santa Clara, and kind of experiencing it from the front row seat, right? And every once in a while, you have to put your hand up and say, hey, have you thought about this? And it used to be that they didn't want to hear it, but now they're actually saying, hey, could you come over here and tell us that thing that you were pointing at us a few years ago? Father Brendan, you had some thoughts on this also.
So I guess from the point of view, like why is the church involved in it is sort of one of the questions, and why is the Jesuit institution involved in it, and it's why here, why now? And I think if you look at it, the church as institution is the oldest institution that's been around. We're 2,000 years old, and in those years, we've learned a thing or two, both for good or for bad. We've learned what works and what doesn't work. We've made lots of mistakes, so it's not like we're the perfect institution. But I do think the spirit is part of that institution, and especially with the Jesuit over 500 years of tradition, right, has led us to certain sort of perspective how to look at things in order to take the longer view. And with that longer view, you start to notice patterns at maybe a different angle. And I think, for example, we've been through as technology some major inflection points over these last years. So like in the 90s, you had the inflection point of the internet. And that exploded, and that just exploded. As I was entering into the seminary and leaving I was at that point, I was involved in all that and the excitement and all that. And I think we've learned a couple of things. So some things we got right and some things we probably made some mistakes. So that inflection point gave us some obvious sort of challenges or things to learn from. And then comes along the mobile, which again brings us an enormous amount of new, sort of excitement for society and promises There's some which were delivered, some which were not delivered, and some of which, I mean, we think of what the power you have in your phone today. It was fitted, even when I was in school, fitted in a room this size. I mean, so it's extraordinary the advancements that have been made. But what comes to that, some challenges, and I think we might have missed some opportunities to improve the implementation of that. And then you come along with social media, and I don't think any of us need any sort of schooling on how we've had some missteps on that. And what I mean by that is both technology implementers, those who were implementing, those who were consumers, ourselves, but also the regulators, governments, and authorities who say we should or maybe we should not do some things. And I think that this particular inflection point, as a church, we look at it and says, I mean, again, I'm testifying that, you know, I've been on this journey with people for well over 12 years. They've been saying that, they're warning us, like, we need to take this seriously. Even this year, we have, you know, the head of one of these, the OpenAI, Sam Altman, has raised the alarm bell. We need regulation. Like, we all, now, I don't want to be the alarm bell ringer, but when one of the ones inside is saying we need regulation, it better, we might want to take note. I think it's time we maybe say, we've learned a thing or two from the past. And certainly from the perspective of church, having a look at trends, we say, oh yeah, we definitely need to look at this. And so this, what we've done in this handbook, is advance that conversation. Advance it with a sort of a platform with which to think. And I think we're at an inflection point where we can play a significant, both from a church, Ignatian, but also in a human role. I think we can play a pretty darn significant impact. And we hope to, because I think, you know, humanity's best self is yet to be shown. And I think we can look at that.
That's a great ending point. At this point, we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. And we actually had someone who jumped in with a question this morning. Lanny.
I said it so I wouldn't have to expose myself. So here's the question for the panelists. For each of you, if you so or so inclined. But first, before I ask the question, I really appreciate this framing, the piece on the quality movement and your vision. I'm old enough to have been a part of that in the Midwest, and met directly with G. Edward Stemming. That's a really interesting narrative that I didn't see in the handbook, but it's an interesting one. But I appreciate this framing, as well as the work you've done and the vision that's implicit in it. It's timely and inspiring. So thank you. My question is from a skeptic's point of view, but it's a genuine question, and it doesn't mean I don't mean it to be disruptive or disrespectful. Here's the question: to what degree do you believe that companies, especially those engaged in STEM-intensive product development, design, manufacturing, marketing, but to what degree do you believe that companies actually do have the capacity or capability, more precisely, to actually behave ethically? That's the question. And then what evidence do you have that supports your belief? And a little context for that question is about. The question comes in part from skepticism expressed long ago by Reinhold Niebuhr's classic Moral Man and Immoral Society. And from the more contemporary current growing skepticism of ESG, and from the inexorable momentum of shareholder returns.
Maybe,
As a close friend of mine, one last comment. Sorry. As a close friend of mine, a former tech executive, and several publicly traded companies, and the chairman of one of those suggests corporate ethics is really matter, this is a quote, direct quote, corporate ethics is really more a matter of compliance than anything else.
I'll answer from maybe the 50,000 foot level, and then maybe Brian and Anne can jump in from having consulted to many ethics companies on ethics to companies and offer. I will say this: my experience with working and listening to not maybe confessional level, but certainly a level of concerns that my experience, and again, I don't have access to all the CEOs, but I haven't. I mean, it's a fairly wide and deep pool of people I talk to. I would say they're all trying to do the right thing, and I think that there's goodness in their heart. Now, it's not to say there aren't some bad actors. Of course there are, but I don't perceive them to be doing it necessarily. Like, I think it's often a lack of resources and tools and focus and priorities. So the question then becomes, how do they make that a priority when there's competing priorities? That's the issue. And how do you raise it? And they need help with competing priorities. That's my experience. And primarily around profit-driven shareholder value versus stakeholder value. So the intention, like, there is this shift from the concept of governance moving from shareholder-only value to shareholder value inside other stakeholder value. And I think that conversation is changing in corporate America, and it needs to be in dialogue more and more. I also think it needs outside pressure, so don't get me wrong. I'm not naive enough to think that it's all going to be inside the court. They're going to suddenly be magnificent, wonderful and beneficial to everybody. I think they need outside pressure, and I think that's where government regulation and regulators need to be proactive and not be reactive. And so they need to get in earlier, and I do think there's that combination. But I have enough anecdotal evidence, and I think the Marketing Center has enough research evidence to suggest that the willingness is there, the tools may not be there. That would be my first instinct. I don't know if you guys want to jump in.
Well, I think it's a great question, Lenny, and again, it's partly the question that inspires me to do the work I do, which is to see that individuals inside of organizations want to do the right thing, but they sometimes collectively, that's not the behavior that we see. And so what are the forces that can help to shift that? And I guess my hope is at a peak right now in terms of things coming together, because I hear, and read and recognize sort of the cynicism, for example, around ESG and the fact that that's environment, social, and governance issues inside of organizations that have been written about and tracked now pretty significantly for the past 7 to 10 years. But prior to that, it was CSR, corporate social responsibility, and now there's an accompanying DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I guess what I would say is that what is expressed in those all of those acronyms is the desire of human beings to do better and to make a contribution. And I am also inspired by the work of some academics at Wharton who did a paper to sort of answer the question of what is the purpose of business. And they went around and they asked everybody to finish this analogy. Law is to justice as medicine is to health, as business is to blank. And got people to say, what do you think the purpose of business is? And the answer that people gave back was either, some version of prosperity or welfare, which of course these academics turned into optimized collective value, a term that only academics can love, but that's okay. The spirit is still there in terms of what people's hope for business is, which is that it can make that positive contribution. And so I put all that together with what we're seeing now in terms of market forces. And companies do respond to market forces. They have to. And so there's two things happening. One is the values that are being expressed by the employees in organizations, Gen Z and millennials who are bringing their values to work, and similarly consumers who are making their purchasing decisions again, bringing their values into the store, into the financial service organization, whatever the transaction is going to be. They're wanting to know more about those organizations and the values and the ways that they're making decisions. So I think that those things are there. But then this new technology is really stunning people, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's got people back on their heels a bit about how powerful it is. And I think people are unsettled by that. And by people, I mean both inside the companies and then also the consumers. And so most of the polling that's going on right now is showing that concern and that desire, that level of discomfort that, you know, if previously I struggled to have an individual, a person inside of a company be accountable for something, now you're asking me to be comfortable with having a machine make that decision. And I'm not comfortable with that. So my word for that is the accountability gap. There's a gap there that people are not willing to give over to machines that they might have felt more comfortable with human beings. And that is going to require and force companies to address, to meet that, to close that gap, because people are not going to just give it over in that way. And that's showing up enough in the polling, I think, and in consumer behavior that we're going to be able to, that's another, I guess, example of a market force that I think companies are going to have to respond to. So when I put together the good intentions, which aren't enough, but they are there, which is wonderful that they are there, the fact that they're coming for the tools now, as you point out, they're reaching out to us, the Markkula Center, instead of the other way around. And they're embedded in organizations trying to make that change, and then they have to respond to these external forces. I think, and I haven't even mentioned climate and all that is bringing to bear in the moment in terms of urgency. And AI is both a problem when it comes to the climate, but it's also potentially part of the solution. And so I think people are seeing, you know, there has to be some collective efforts that actually start to work. and so I have a lot of hope. I mean, I think for now, it's as good as it gets in terms of the chances of organizations having the capacity to actually do it.
A couple of thoughts. Business of compliance. Compliance to what? Compliance to regulation. That's the first thing you think about. But also think about compliance to standards. That's back to the quality movement. Right? At Sandisk, I was running operations with a lot of subcontractors in China. And one of the requirements was that they had to be ISO 9000 certified. We're not doing business with that. So that's, I think, another driving force in parallel to regulation. And the other item or situation to think about is the people. Unethical companies are having and are going to have a hard time attracting talents. So they have to show that they're ethical if they want to get the best people working for them.
Especially with the younger generation, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you definitely know that they're not willing to comply as easy as previous generations. So it is definitely real.
All right. I think we have time for another question. Hopefully a couple more, but at least one more. Questions? All right.
So it may be too early to ask this question, so you can make a hypothetical answer if you like. But as you shared the handbook with companies and as they really thought about where they are on the journey and how the handbook can help them, what's the best story you can think about without revealing the name of the company of how the handbook has helped them on their journey?
I want to repeat the question so that it could be for the cameras later.
So the question is, do we have a story that we can share about how the handbook has helped an organization on their journey? And the answer is that the handbook's been out for a little over 4 months. So we don't have a really great story at this point.
I think we have a few.
We have a couple stories. So so the two corporate boards that we've talked to, I think, are two success stories right there. which are that they actually want to talk to us, and we're talking to board level of multi-billion-dollar corporations. So the very fact that they're interested in talking about this, I think, is a big, that's a big shift. That's a big success right there. But as far as the implementation, that's the next stage, right? You have to get the commitment, and then you have to decide where you are. I mean, we use the metaphor of a journey, of a road trip. You have to decide that you're going to make a trip. You have to decide where you are, where you're going to go, how you're going to get there, and then you have to monitor your progress along that path. And so we're really at the beginning right now. But Anne, did you have more?
Well, I was going straight to those conversations that we've had in boardrooms, and I was thinking of one specific exchange with the last one that we did, where really this accountability gap issue sort of came up again, which is the board member was observing that certain decisions, for example, people are very uncomfortable about using AI in human resource decisions and sort of how that's going to be regulated. And certain states have started to put in laws that really put some guardrails up around that. And he was observing, well, I've never had to explain the rationale behind why I hire or don't hire somebody in the past. And so why do I have to explain it now? And the answer, and sort of came to the answer himself, which is, because it's a machine doing it and people don't trust the machines. And so that's that sort of dawning of something has shifted and we're going to have to actually be more responsive, be able to explain our rationale and our thinking in greater detail than we've ever had to do before, because we've introduced machines into the equation. If we had just left it with the humans, we wouldn't have so much explaining to do. But now we're going to actually have to do it more. And they had a couple of products and a couple of practices where they could, you could see kind of the light bulb going on in the room in the sense of like, we've got some exposure here because of just even what we offer in the industry and the business that we're in. So that kind of in the moment, and that was also the group where, we had been more focused on the stages and they wanted to spend more time on the principles. And that, I think, told me a lot in terms of the level at which the wheels are turning is not, it's not at the how do I make a buck here level. That's not actually the question that was in the room. The question in the room was, how do I do something that's going to be good and seen as good, and I'm responsible for that.
So can I jump in? I want to offer a metaphor that might hold this a little bit well for us. I think we're at a shift in where we're at in, again, the paradigm of inflection point is helpful. But let me give you a metaphor that holds this inflection point for us. I think, do you remember when we used paper maps? Remember those things? When you had them in your car? You kind of laugh at them. How many of you have got a paper map in your car anymore? Not a single one of you. I don't even have one. Not even a single one. We use everything on the GPS. But there was that awkward time at the beginning where you pulled out your paper map, even though you had the GPS in your system. You didn't quite know how to use it yet because you were figuring, I've got a map, it's great. And then you figured out, this thing really helps with a whole ton of things because it's dynamic, it's engaged, it does a whole lot of feedbacking. It tells me not only where I want to go, but it tells me where I am. And guess what? Along the way, it's going to inform me about what the traffic, and it will redirect us. In a sense, we're at the beginning of shifting from a paper map to a dynamic, and this is why this handbook is so critical, because it's a dynamic reality. This is not going to be the only version. This is the first of many versions that will happen. And then it gets implemented. We're at this shift, this awkwardness. So implementation is, people don't even know how to use it because they've never used it before. All they've been used to is asking simple check mark questions. Yes, done, yes, done, yes, done. Okay, next board item, agenda, right? And I think what we're teaching people here is a whole shift in mentality. You're going to use this in a completely different way. Now, you're going to have to use this because everything is becoming so dynamic. You're going to need something like this. I believe firmly, that this needs to be turned into an AI-enabled platform. A platform that actually enables you to do it and query it like your ChatGPT version. You would actually query it as you would, I'm trying to make a decision, I want to make sure it's ethical. And it comes back with questions with which you dialogue with it. That's ultimately, we'd love to where it goes. But we're a long way from there. Does that help with the question?
Thank you.
I have a suggestion for you. If I can. There's a book by Heikel called The Adaptive Organization. It came out of IBM's work in the late 90s. But it's an articulation of what you just envisioned in terms of making the framework malleable and adaptive, which is what software enables us to do. So you can write and rewrite contracts. Those aren't sticky anymore. It's a wonderful vision. I recommend it. It's called The Adaptive Organization by Heikel.
Thank you.
One other suggestion, if you'll indulge me, it'll be brief. I believe you need a frame for the framework. A frame for the principles. And I think you have two things. One you've already mentioned, and that is, what's the purpose of a business? Peter Drucker years ago, 1961, said, the purpose of a business is to create and serve a customer. It's simple, it's elegant, it's relational, and it is moral. It's a sweet spot that I think is right in front of you. There's another sweet spot. It's a purpose, teleology. The other sweet spot is what is mission critical for commercial companies, and it's value. And if there's anything more moral and ethical than value, I don't know what it is. So I think those are perhaps entrees, thresholds for the framework and the frame of the principles.
Thank you.
One question, please. You talked about the political, cultural, and social aspects, impacts on organizations in terms of ethical decision making. Is there a discussion, you started a little bit about, of the economic impact of decision making, ethical decision making on organizations?
So to repeat the question, the questioner asked, you talk about social, you talk about cultural, but what about the economic impact of this? So thoughts from the panel.
Of the framework itself, is that your question? Yeah, I think you can't uncouple the political, social, and other cultural questions from the economic. I think one of the things that trips us up sometimes in talking about optimized collective value, or sort of what business is trying to create, is around time horizon. So I think a lot of the shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism has been, or more openness to meeting the needs of more stakeholders, has been sort of a softening of people's thinking about the time horizon, and a lot more articulation about making those decisions for the long term. And that started with some leadership from people like Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, which is one of the largest asset managers, if not the largest in the world. And so certainly he's thinking about economic value, but he's saying you have to make decisions that are going to create value over the long term to try, I think, and get away from some of the more short-term thinking. And so I think those things are still compatible, and I think important. I mean, businesses need to be profitable, and that's how they continue to reinvest in their own organizations and their own future products. It's how they invest in their own employees, and it's how they develop those relationships with customers that last over time. So I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive. I see them as mutually reinforcing.
I guess I would give two perspectives on the economic impact. Number one is that the downstream impact is also can be a negative financial impact if they don't succeed in being this, because the product will be used for ill, and then they'll end up having to cost more in litigation, a lot of our things. That's one aspect. But also the aspect is the earlier you get involved in it, in ethic, then the less it costs too, because you've built everything as you go along, as opposed to rebuilding. So, but then comes we're talking about a lot of mature companies, And Silicon Valley has a reputation as build fast, break it, and rebuild, right? So there's this sense like I can't afford your ethics. I remember one of my CEO friends said, "Brendan, a lovely idea, but we can't afford it. We can't afford to slow down because somebody else will go faster than us." So that's a real concern. There's no question about it. But I think is that there are growing pressures inside the VC area now, and we have at Market Center have started a VC ethics also division, if you would, or portion. And the idea that VC now, the venture capitalists really do want ethical design, and they're kind of saying you've got to build it in at the beginning because we're not going to pay for any downside. So you're starting to see that happen already. So where they're willing to fund ethical approaches to things. But I do think that it doesn't necessarily have to cost the product if everybody's doing it. So there's a cost factor, right? If everyone's doing it, then the cost gets better. There's no competitive disadvantage. But if only one or two doing it, then it can be a cost disadvantage. But reputationally, what is of value? So that becomes the stakeholder versus shareholder. Who you're serving, what's your final goal? And I think you're finding the pressure cooker is beginning to create. And we want to fuel that so that everyone does it at the same time. Larger companies, smaller companies, and the more to do it, then the pressure cooker is everyone's got to do it. It's to the point where, if that makes sense.
Jose, did you want to? No. Okay. Well, what I will say is that we all have to live in the future that we're living together. And so I've been to meetings where CEOs get up there and say, you realize that we're not necessarily making the world that we want to live in, right? And so this idea of the fact that they have to live in the same world with us, and if we destroy the world, then they might have the privilege of being the last to experience that because of their, money gives you a certain amount of insulation from reality. But seriously, the environment's not going well. The political environment in the country is not going well. There are lots and lots of problems. And technology, artificial intelligence, social media, whatever it is, these different kinds of technology, take those same social problems and just light them on fire, make them bigger than they were before and much larger scale, and just extend it, across the entire planet. And so this realization that has come into some people's mind is that, okay, this is actually a big deal. We have technology here that's really powerful that we weren't really thinking about before. I mean, one thing that I say over and over again is that in the past we were limited by our weakness. We didn't have the capability to do many of the things that we can do now. So we were limited by our weakness. We were involuntarily limited in that way. Now we need to learn to be voluntarily limited by our good judgment. And that's where ethics steps in. Ethics is the thing that lets us look at a situation and say, is this something we want to do or something that we don't want to do? And if we can envision the future, the consequences of our actions, then we should try to choose the better consequences and not the worst ones. Otherwise, we're going to end up living in a terrible world. But hopefully, the handbook will prevent that terrible world from happening.
I do think to close on what you're asking, I think the more thought that goes into it, then you're going to get more answers to those questions. The challenge is getting people to pause and think about these impacts, both socially and economically, but we want them to think about it because that's what the challenge is let's start talking about it, let's pause, let's have a look at some of this stuff and get those conversations going. That's the desire of our book. And the work we're doing is simply, let's pause, have conversation, go back, let's pause, keep doing what Ignatius did, which is discern the spirits. Where is this going? Where is it leading? Pause, reflect, keep on coming. I mean, that's what Ignatius was famous for. So, I mean, that's what we want to encourage people to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you to the Ignatian Center.
No, thank you all. Thanks to the panel. Round of applause for joining me.